So let's get to it, dear panelists. A power game or a team play here? What will be the outcome of the G20 Summit? As always, let's begin with a quick fire round of 30 seconds each and pick up the conversation from there. So, Mr. Bowman, please, Bowman, excuse me, sir, please take the lead.
Thank you so much. Some on the political right view international organizations and fora such as the G20 as some combination of a waste of time or a threat to national sovereignty. And on the political left, there's sometimes a reflexive infatuation with international organizations and fora, confusing multilateral meetings, communiques, and processes with tangible progress and substance, and perhaps are too quick to give up national sovereignty at sometimes. I come down in the middle. I agree with the view common on the right that nation states remain the primary actor in international policy, but I also think we need to work with partners to address some challenges that transcend national borders.
Okay, and we'll get to all of this in a split second. Emmanuel Dupuy, your take?
Well, the creation of the summit, as it was initiated in 1999, was about broadly economical cooperation or economical mutualization. We have seen with this summit, which has Joko Widodo, the president of Indonesia, put it, was the most difficult summit of this last era, shows that it's not only about geoeconomic, it's about geopolitics. Moreover, as the international system is failing, as the multilateralism is showing its fatigue, as we have seen it already during the last 77 General Assembly of the United Nations a few weeks ago.
Yeah, fatigue might be an understatement in this respect. Last but definitely not least, Helmut Rachawanski, your thoughts?
So my thought is that there's absolutely value in all platforms for dialogue and joint problem solving, and those with less rules and actually less bureaucracy are actually often more flexible, more dynamic, like the G20. The G20, importantly, also brings geopolitical competitors together. We have very few spaces like that today, and we have a growing geopolitical crisis in the world. We've also seen that face-to-face meetings matter. We all learned this during the pandemic. But I also want to say these formats could do better. There could be more participation.
Okay, and in this respect, let's begin our conversation, and please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Who is attending with their hands on top, in the sense that which leaders are going in as the strongest, so to speak? Please begin, Helmut Rachawanski.
Well, I mean, first of all, if you want a sports competition, you should go to Qatar. The G20 is not where one, leaves at the end with a gold medal or cup. Success, by definition, means collaboration. And because the lack of collaboration means there will be no results and no solutions to pressing problems facing the world. So I think any leader wants to walk away from there with solutions to problems in hand, and that requires collaboration. So, I mean, we always saw that one leader who's glaring, absence is President Putin of Russia. And that illustrates his position in the world and Russia's position in the world today. President Zelensky of Ukraine was also unable, for other reasons, to attend. And that is, of course, a very dramatic illustration of where we stand today. There were some successes. They are probably not very much. We have a statement about the inadmissibility of nuclear war. It only restates decades of consensus, but it's something. And there was a call to resolve conflicts peacefully. Yeah. And again, in the year 2022, that's already something.
Absolutely, to declare peace is a desired route. And in this respect, the elephant in the room, not going to be in the room, Russian President Vladimir Putin staying away. Is it merely symbolic, Mr. Dupuy? He might be isolated, but in terms of calling the global shots at the moment, who's more substantial, Biden or Putin?
Well, I think both Biden and Putin were at the center of the stage, and I should add Xi Jinping for various reasons. First of all, because Xi Jinping and Biden were the re-elected in the room, and this brought a sort of legitimacy or new legitimacy or democratic legitimacy. The American president has not lost the Senate, and the president has lost in a more stronger position, if I may say so, the Chamber of Representatives. So therefore, Joe Biden appears with this solidarity and the perenniety of the sustain of the both NATO and the European Union, as well as Occidental countries aside this already transatlantic or Atlantic landscape. Of course, is allies in Asia, which are, of course, Japan, Australia, Anthony Albanese being again very strong on this perspective. I see another perspective to your question is saying that G20 has another elephant in the room. Of course, the absence of Putin was very relevant, but what I have in mind and what I think is that G20 will be undoubtedly enlarged, because a certain number of countries who have been invited this time, if you take the example of Senegal, President Macky Sall has been invited not only because he's president of Senegal, but because he's president of the African Union, which of course represents a 21 or 21st GDP, which can be added to this G20. And of course you have a certain number of invités. I take the example of the Rwandese president, Paul Kagame, and a certain number of other candidates to other organizations which are clustered inside G20. Of course, the enlargement of the BRICS to Algeria, which may give an impression that there's a sort of regional multilateralism or sort of Indo-Pacific multilateralism, which of course is concretely an evidence because Indonesia is hosting the G20 this year, and because India will host it next year.
And perhaps, if anything at all, we're seeing a rising clout, or at least political prospects of such regional alliances, let it be NATO or others, as you mentioned, Mr. Dupuy. But Mr. Bowman, taking into consideration what was mentioned, does the West have any use for the G20 at this point? Mr. Dupuy mentioned potential expansion of global players, but in terms of the Western state of mind, maybe it doesn't need this forum to actually execute its policies or strategies.
You know, as I suggested in my initial comments, you know, I come down the middle. I think one should go, the United States and our democratic allies and partners should go into these meetings with modest expectations. But on the other hand, I view the G20 a bit like I view the UN. It's another field of competition. And if the United States and our allies and partners compete on those fields of competition, we can further our global and national freedom, prosperity, and security. If we dismiss these organizations and vacate the field of competition, I do worry that we'll fail to compete effectively and we'll create a vacuum that will only be filled primarily by the Chinese Communist Party, but also by their junior partners in Moscow and Tehran. So I, for one, say guard your national sovereignty, go into these with modest expectations, but some of the biggest problems of our day require us to cooperate with others, build consensus, and lead to tangible action. The pronouncements are great, but if you really want to know what matters, look at the follow-up. And, something as tangible as like, can we get a deal for the continued export of grain from Ukraine? Right. If some of the discussions of the G20 lead to that, then that's a positive outcome.
So, Almut Roczerwanski, we've mentioned China and obviously the Biden-Xi pre-gaming summit, let's put it that way, dictating the tone for the rest of the summit. Let me ask you clearly, is the world a safer place now in the aftermath of this one-on-one rendezvous of Biden and Xi?
Well, I think if in the last 48 hours something happened that showed us the world is a slightly safer place, it was the reaction to, and this is a completely different thing, to that missile that fell on Polish territory and killed 2 people there, because the way that this was handled by everybody involved was actually quite mature and reassuring to those of us who are concerned about the threat of nuclear escalation.
Even the Kremlin hailing the conduct of the Americans in this respect, saying they're responsible and restrained and professional, I think was the wording.
I think also the Polish government deserves credit here. And it is interesting, of course, that it coincided with the G20 summit, but I'm only saying it's interesting. It's certainly a coincidence. If I would say that any face-to-face contacts are valuable in that respect. They will at least incrementally make us safer because channels for conversation are critical for all of our security.
And before we conclude this first part of our own summit here, should we be expecting to any bottom line, as Mr. Bowman suggested, the grain export deal, for example, or is the declaration going to be optimistically vague? Let's put it that way, Mr. Dupuy.
Well, there has been some significant outcomes. If I just take the presentation or the final conference made by Emmanuel Macron, calling for more unity, not only on the wheat deal, as you mentioned, which will be coming to finalization Friday, but calling for more interest for Africa. In French, we call that droit de tirage spéciaux, special, well, the $100 billion of dollars which the International Monetary Fund must invest when it comes to sustain the economies of Africa. This is a concrete step to take in consideration the impact of this war, the impact of the COVID crisis, and to go a bit further, the impact of the economic crisis in 2008. I would also think, with my colleague from Maine, that the nuclear issue was an important milestone, because there's not that much places where you can discuss with partners who are detainees of the nuclear deterrence capability and others who tend to want it. And I think this was an important agenda which was not on top of the agenda prior to the G20, but which invited himself to the agenda.
Okay, and on that note, we will put a stop right here, but we will be continuing our discussion right after the break. Helmut Roczerwanski, Bradley Bowman, and Emmanuel Dupuy, you're staying with us. A quick break, and we're back with the rest of the summit. Okay, let's get to it. We have been touching this topic earlier, but if no breakthrough will be made, or at least some progress in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, the most pressing global issue at the moment, can we declare the G20 summit obsolete? Let's begin with another quick fire round of 30 seconds each and pick up the conversation from there. Helmut Roczerwanski, please take the lead.
Well, it's not obsolete in the sense that we should just stop it. Could it be a better format? Could it be improved? Absolutely. Like I said before, we should have more participation. And by that, I mean there should be inclusion of civil society, of youth, of the populations that are concerned with these issues. We shouldn't just hear their voices and hear about their needs, but we should also listen to them, because they are the ones who often come up with the best solutions to pressing problems, including the problem of peace and an end to war in Ukraine. And I spend most days chatting with Ukrainian activists, and they have very good ideas, and we should hear them.
Okay, maybe we will be elaborating on that shortly. Mr. Bradley Bowman, your thoughts?
You know, I think communication is helpful in international relations. Communication can facilitate better understanding and avoid dangerous miscalculation that can lead to additional disasters. But I think we need to be careful to underscore that ultimately power is the ultimate guarantee of peace and security. And there may be lots of smiles at the G20, but in the end, the Chinese Communist Party and the Taiwan Strait, for example, is going to proceed with what they think they can get away with, regardless of what is said at meetings like the G20.
Emmanuel Dupuy, lots of smiles and talk, but little action.
Well, I think what is important is to reinvent multilateralism. Multilateralism is bringing new actors, the ones who have not been invited to these type of summits, which is the case for African continent, for example, but also to have non-state actors. This was already mentioned, to have societal actors such as religious engagement, because this is important. And I think G20 can be the perfect example of mixing together track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 diplomacy, bringing also local initiatives which are more and more relevant in international relations.
And in this respect, please feel free to interact. Of course, Helmut Roczerwanski, listening to Mr. Dupuy, maybe the G20 is, or rather us covering the G20 summit, is too much focused or fixated on geopolitics. Maybe other objectives can create a greater consensus, or what other solutions to elevate the clout of this forum have you been hearing?
Well, I should say that when we see the G20 summit, it might look to us as if it's just 2 days of powerful leaders meeting in a vacation spot. But what it really is a process that goes on for months and often year-round of high-level, dedicated policymakers and diplomats engaging with each other in preparation for these summits. And so what happens there, the decisions that are made there, they are the result of months of dedicated work. Yeah. And that's the value in it. But again, like, it could also be more open, it could be more transparent, it could be more participatory, it could bring in more voices and more ideas.
And speaking of more voices, Elon Musk in attendance too, virtually, albeit the real new emerging power, Mr. Dupuy?
Well, I think you've touched and you raised the most important problem is the fact that in international relations you have certain sort of a schizophrenic diplomatic perspective. First of all, you have states willing to engage more and more with each other, and I think this is important because you have newcomers who are trying to challenge oldcomers or trying to compete for the leadership inside regional, multilateral ownership of international relations. And on the other hand, you have the sort of Uberization or liberalization of the world in which non-state actors weight as much, not to say much more.
Yeah.
If you take, for example, the GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Metaverse, Microsoft, they have won more money than the 6 biggest hydrocarbon company, oil and gas company. Therefore, they are actors. They are international actors. Elon Musk is the perfect example of having a global influence, because he now owns Twitter, because he is into spatial initiative, and because, of course, he is a provider of development for a certain number of countries in which he is investing. And I think the G20 must take in consideration this maybe opposition linked agenda. On one hand, states want to reaffirm their ownership of international security. On the other hand, you have non-state actors who want to change the rules of the game in order to gain more money, in order to pay less wages, and in order to influence more the society in which they are investing. And therefore, you need rules. You need a rule-based order. If the United Nations is no longer relevant
Bowman,
to play this role, because
you keep on rightfully perhaps circling back to the Chinese question. Is the world heading to a bipolar or a multi-polar power struggle? And perhaps not less importantly, will global nations be forced to choose sides, so to speak?
I think we're already in a multipolar world. I would consider China, the United States, Russia, and others as part of that. The United States has never confronted an adversary like China that combines a hostile ideology, an economy essentially as large as ours, and a rapidly improving military that in some cases is as good as our own. That's bad news for the United States. That's bad news for our allies, and I'd say that's bad news for global peace and security. So, the G20 includes China, right? So, that's why we should have modest expectations, and that's why if you look at the G20 Bali Leaders Declaration, it was pathetically weak with respect to Ukraine because China is running cover for Russia there. But if you look at the joint statement of NATO and the G7 leaders, democracies, they called a spade a spade. They talked about Russian barbaric acts in Ukraine. So, this is all great. My colleague said, we need to have a return to multilateralism. Well, I have a multilateral organization for you. It's called NATO. And NATO is why we've had 70 years of relative peace in Europe and why Putin has invaded Georgia and Ukraine, but not a NATO member. That's because of power, military power. So I'm all for diplomacy, I'm all for development, but sometimes the role of military power in securing peace, freedom, and prosperity is overlooked.
Yes, as you've been mentioning earlier in the broadcast, Mr. Bowman, the same diplomatic deadlock of the UN Security Council with the veto power of opposing powers at the same time leading nowhere. And as we're nearing the end of our discussion, Helmut Roshawansky, you are accurately pointing out that we shouldn't be looking at it as a soccer match, so to speak, speak of who wins and who loses, but if we were to look for a bottom line of this year's summit and look for a success or failure, what would that be?
Well, a success is that we are back to, these are very modest successes. We are back to face-to-face diplomacy after a long pandemic. We should not underestimate that. We are back to reaffirming consensus that we've had for decades about the inadmissibility of nuclear war, about the preference for peaceful solution of conflict. Like I said, these are modest goals. I would argue that when we read the document closely and we sort of like imagine in our heads the weeks and months of drafting that went into it, and you ask yourselves, why are certain issues ranked second and certain other issues are ranked first? And it may, global climate change, which is without a doubt the greatest challenge to all of us, the greatest threat to all of us, is not ranked first. This may be because of the G20's, raison d'etre, but still.
Well, beggars can be choosers, and in times where potential nuclear catastrophe and a third world war are being thrown up in the air, face-to-face meeting might be just good enough. Dear panelists, thank you so very much for your time and insight today. Hopefully we will see you again on Global Eye soon.